Application logging and the way that we store those logs has continued to get better and cheaper over the years. Ultimately, this looks like engineers logging more and more information for themselves, for the services that they care about, but it doesn't provide us more context as to what is happening in our modern distributed systems. And while tooling has enabled us to, again, store more and more logs, we know that as an industry, people look at less than 1% of all logs that are actually generated. So what can we do with all this noise? Is there a better way to think about logging? The short answer is yes, obviously. If you're here on this channel right now, then you might know that Lightstep is an observability platform, the best observability platform. Thank you very much. All jokes aside, let's talk about what that actually means and how we can do something much better than more sophisticated logging. So we're going to talk about distributed tracing for a second, and I'm actually going to jump into Lightstep to do this. So I'm jumping in Lightstep to do this. We're going to talk about distributed tracing, but first let's just dive into an individual trace. I'm actually going to find one with an interesting log from one of our services. So let's go down to our profile service. All right, so now I have a set of traces here up on the screen that all have errors, and we'll just jump into one. It doesn't really matter. What we really want to focus on is this log event, this stack trace on the bottom right of the screen. So looking at this here, we can see that this is just some runtime information generated at runtime. Logs are great, right? So if we imagine we have some stack, you might be a Java engineer. You're going to have some JVM-centric stuff in your logs. If you're working on some Lambdas that are Node.js, you're going to have some Node.js specific information in your log statement. Logs are high detail, as we can see here. They're very relevant and relative to the function that generated them and the framework that generated them at runtime. But if we look at just one log in isolation, it doesn't matter how many of them we generate, how sophisticated we are in maybe analyzing the occurrences of these logs, which is something a lot of tools do today. Hey, we're seeing a huge spike in a number of logs that look like this. That doesn't really tell us a story about what our system is doing. All it really tells us is a story about what this function is doing, what that thing that generated the log is doing. A much better story, a much better way to think about our system is by taking a step back and looking at what this log, this stack trace is appended to here on the screen right now, this distributed trace. So a trace is essentially a distributed log. If this is your first foray into distributed tracing, or if you're not familiar with what distributed tracing is, really you can think of it as taking this information, taking a log and just adding a few more details to it, right? So the runtime of the function, right? So spans can get down to any degree of fidelity, but this span, this get profile for user span, which is highlighted now, it has an amount of time, it has a name, and it has all of this metadata attached to it, these attributes, these key value pairs, and the log events that it generated at runtime. Now, what's even more important about this, if we go over to this details pane, is it has a span ID, a trace ID, a parent ID, and this connects it to all of these other spans in our environment. So now nothing that happens in our system happens in isolation anymore, which is never the case, right? It doesn't make sense for us to look at discrete pieces of data that are generated on our authentication service, because the authentication service doesn't authenticate things unless there's someone doing some user interaction. It could be an API call, it might be logging in via the UI. There is no reason to authenticate unless there's some other set of events that requires authentication. So it makes much more sense for us to always have that context, and that's what distributed tracing allows us to do. So you're never looking at just a piece of data about your system anymore. We're always actually thinking about our system when we look at distributed tracing. And that's cool. It's really awesome to be able to look at individual traces as we're doing now. Even individual traces can bring us back to the place where we were with logging, where if we're just doing trace collection, now we're looking at discrete transactions. Now we're just saying, okay, here is some event, some set of series of things that happened in my system, but really I need to understand my system, right? I really want to observe my system and understand and think about my system as more of a state machine. In order to do that, then we need to analyze all of this data, all these permutations of events constantly over time. And that's really what we do with Lightstep. There's something much more powerful that we can do with this. So I'm actually going to jump over to this other screen here and jump into a metrics dashboard. So this dashboard is going to bring us into change intelligence. Change intelligence allows us to answer the question of what caused that change, right? And then ultimately remove us away from caring about these individual sources or types of data, right? I originally started this video, we were talking about logging, then I talked about traces, and now we're looking at metrics. At the end of the day, engineers don't care, right? If we look back again, thinking about an individual log statement, I'm not looking at a log statement because I really like logs or I want to know, what that log statement or what that function did. Really, I'm trying to build a story together, and I don't care if I could arrive at that conclusion via some other data type, then I would. Or if I could do it without looking at discrete pieces of data altogether, I would. And that's what we're about to do right now. So if I look at this memory utilization graph on the middle right side of the screen, I can actually select this moment in time as a deviation, and then I can choose what caused this change. In the background, Lightstep is now going to analyze, in this case, distributed trace data to tell me what caused the change in this specific signal, right? This change in memory utilization, which might be creeping up towards an outage, very common scenario, or it could be a garbage collection graph, which is not behaving or is emitting a pattern that looks unhealthy. It could be CPU utilization. It could be any particular metric in your system which is a signifier of a either good health or bad health, but now we can add a context to that signal, which is much more powerful than, again, just that discrete piece of data, whether it's a log or a individual metric. Let's not just enrich data to enrich data. Let's not just store more and more data to store more and more data because we know that someone's going to have to look at it later. Let's do something much more intelligent. Let's actually analyze this data. Let's always have context with our data so that individual engineers aren't spending time trying to become experts of data, and instead they can become experts at building and delivering software that we care about, and really, doing the things that are more important. These indiscrete pieces of data, if we invent a new data type tomorrow, let's call them super logs or super traces or metrics or super metrics or whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. All of these are just ways to think about our system, and what is much more important than any of that are the insights that we can build on top of that. That being said, that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you wanted to add more to it, please leave your thoughts down in the comments. If you are curious about Lightstep or want to get in touch with me or any of my peers, you can find us on Twitter, LightstepHQ. You can email me directly, forrest@lightstep.com. You can just go to lightstep.com, check out everything that we have there. The environment that I was just showing is actually available in a sandbox. You can check that out. But that is it for this one. Thank you for stopping by.